From the Post Building in downtown North St. Louis, this is Inside City. Hi, good morning, Dennis. Thanks for giving me a few minutes to talk about innovation districts and why you're in St. Louis and how you got here. And what I usually try to do is get to something maybe that I've watched some of the different podcasts and read. And so something I think that's interesting is you used to be a preacher in New England. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how being a preacher in a congregation, I think you had also a very diverse congregation of different pieces.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that may have been pretty good without really planning, but a good precursor for helping to collaborate and bring groups and communities together.
Yeah. So my formal educational training
Theology and philosophy, right? Yeah.
Philosophy undergrad, which really exposed me to broad thinking and concepts. And with that, I also, while I was in my undergrad in Chicago, I also worked in a coffee house and people going in and out across the country. This was back in the late 60s, okay?
Yeah, right.
So got to see a lot of, again, different attitudes, different approaches to life, what was important to people. And then while I was an undergrad, I also went and spent a summer in the Far East in Indonesia.
Oh, wow.
And that was in 1970, Vietnam War time.
Yeah.
Got exposed to a lot of international thinking about that war, about how others perceived the United States, and then visited my cousin in Thailand who was in the Air Force, and flying fighter cover for B-52 bombers. And the things that I learned that summer, it was a coming of age. Like my eyes were open. I saw what was going on from a whole different cultural perspective, okay? So when I graduated from college, I went to seminary in New England, in the Boston area, and studied theology, and came out of that and was working part-time in a ministry in the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston, which was primarily African American at that time.
I see.
And also working on community housing in the Back Bay neighborhood of Boston. So had my foot in the community in two different ways. One with physical rebuilding and one with spiritual building, so to speak. And that led me to come to the conclusion that I could have a bigger impact by following the community development route than staying in a pulpit. Although I have to tell you that being in that pulpit for about a year or so was pretty enlightening because my congregation was 2/3 Black and 1/3 white. The 2/3 Black were made up of about a third from Jamaica and the Caribbean, and the other third from African Americans living and brought up here in the United States. And it was just interesting to see that cultural difference and how it expressed itself. And the older white folks that were there.
And they all showed up on Sunday. Huh?
Everybody, well, it was an incredible, blend of people, but it was very diverse. And when I would stand up in the pulpit and look out in the mornings, I saw my white older people kind of clustered together. I'd see my African American, Americans clustered together, and the Jamaicans, and the Jamaicans were always just kind of, waving and bobbing and weaving. But it was a congregation that really tied together because they loved each other, and it was great to see that. And then also the work that I was doing with the actually physical redevelopment of certain houses, brownstones in the Back Bay neighborhood of Boston, just blending that all together. And the opportunity came from a mentor of mine to move to Philadelphia to start the National Shared Housing Resource Center. And what we were doing in the Back Bay was rehabbing brownstones and turning them into shared houses for old people and young people. We
Hmm.
called it Young and Old United was the name of the organization.
Interesting. Yeah.
And the whole idea was that young folks have a lot to learn by way of wisdom from older folks
Yeah.
like me. And older folks need the support of younger folks, like to get to medical appointments or buy food,
Sure.
whatever.
And things aren't quite the same as you may have been familiar with, and so they're the new guard coming up. So yeah.
Exactly, and they were all college students, and so it was just really quite a wonderful experience there. And my mentor asked me to go to to Philadelphia and start that shared housing resource center. And then when I was there for 8 years, we set up programs in 20 different states across the United
Wow.
States. And from there, I was asked to go to Atlantic City and take $40 million a year from the casinos
Uh-huh.
and do community development across the state of New Jersey.
Wow.
So that was the background. And then in that position, I was then asked to go to my first innovation district in Newark,
Hmm.
New Jersey, and to start that.
Huh.
And that's where about a 25-year journey of 3 different innovation districts
Uh-huh.
started.
That's really interesting. And because we get into an age where everybody gets specialized in one thing, but it
Right.
sounds like that diversity of experience that you spoke about is really informed and still informs how you work with people.
There's no question. It created a worldview that was very unusual, and I think that, alas, I see us today just becoming so fragmented.
That
Uh,
seems to be the theme,
it's the
just in a lot of
theme in
ways.
a lot of ways across the country and internationally, and that fragmentation comes from a lack of understanding, appreciation, and empathy for other people
Hmm.
and other people's journeys. So I
Hmm.
think that, and I've seen this. I've seen a change as you have in the tech sector too. It used to be you had to have all these credentials. You had to
Hmm.
have engineering degrees,
Right.
behind your name and that sort of thing. And about 10 years ago, that started to change
Hmm.
because it was beginning. A lot of leadership in the tech sector began to realize people have very diverse backgrounds and experiences, and they don't need to have formal educations all the time to do things that traditionally you had to do. Now, of course, you still need so much of that for different vertical
Hmm.
technology verticals, but at the same time, there's been more of a diversification, I think, in the general tech field than there has been in other industries.
And you've talked in other times about the it seems that maybe and not to put words in my mouth, but maybe I'll just say that the default seems to be silos. I know what I'm doing
Yeah.
and leave me alone. And you end up getting all these different silos. And you've talked about the importance of interconnecting and bringing those together in specifically like at Cortex, that there were different pieces there and that you helped orchestrate those pieces coming together when you got here in 2010.
Yeah, I mean, I think that generally, um, we're kind of genetically wired, kind of survival of the fittest.
Mm.
And you take care of your tribe.
Right.
And when you come up against another tribe, there's a little bit of tension,
Yeah. A little
competition,
suspicion. Yeah.
little
Right.
suspicion.
Yeah.
And, we're still trying to work through that. Might take a few more reincarnations to get there, but I saw that in my 3 innovation districts that I worked on.
Hmm.
Um, a number of people and they were all sponsored by nonprofits with institutional partners, both academic and corporate, as well as political,
Hmm.
and governmental folks participating on those boards. Many times, what I saw on those boards, or the first 2 boards that I worked on, the one in Newark and the one in Louisiana, what I saw was people at the table for the wrong reasons. Okay. And this ties back into your silo theme.
Hmm.
They were there to kind of protect their interests and not ostensibly, but practically it read through.
Hmm.
They wanted to make sure that somebody else wasn't jumping ahead of them. So it's that, they were kind of bringing that silo mentality to the
Sure.
table. Of the 3 innovation districts that I worked on, Cortex was, by in far, the most successful, and I attribute it to the fact that, uh, the board members at the table were there for the right reasons, all the
Mhm.
right reasons. They recognized that they individually could not do what needed to be done,
Mhm.
either for their institutions, their companies, their community, that they needed each other. And so that board, historically, now it's over 20 years old, but during that whole time they leaned in.
Mhm.
And in order to break down silos, you have to lean in, and you have
Mhm.
to you have to bring what you have to the table, but you also have to be open to hear other people's views and
So,
perspectives.
an example of that might be Washington University guaranteeing a lease, so that a project could get built. For example, there's some risk there, and what's in it for WashU specifically, I don't know. They're more academic side, but by de-risking it, allow the developer to come to the table. For example.
That's a very good example. And innovation districts need strong sponsors, need strong partners, need strong champions.
Hmm.
And so there were 4 or 5 champions. WashU was one, St. Louis University, University of Missouri St. Louis, BJC Healthcare, and the Missouri Botanical Garden. All
Hmm.
5 of them were at the table to begin with
Hmm.
to say, "Hey, we have to do better here." This is back in the 2000
Yeah.
era. We've got to do better if we're going to, be part of this next wave of economic development that's beginning to sweep across the country that's driven by technology.
Hmm.
So they recognized that no one partner could do it alone, and they were better together. Interesting theme that's cropped up.
Right.
One of the things that I have seen, though, in coming here, I mean, I say that for the Cortex board, but generally speaking, um, eh, you know, we are a fragmented region.
Right.
We are a siloed region. We are a NIMBY kind of region.
Yeah.
Um, and we have to continue to reach higher, reach for our better selves, come together, listen. You know, one of the things that I've constantly remind myself is, I hear them talking so much. Shut up and listen. You got 2 ears and 1
Well,
mouth, as they
we're
say.
doing I'm interviewing you, not the other way around. So I think this is the time when you're supposed to talk. But I mean, in terms then of the fiefdoms that St. Louis tends to regrettably get known for, and that people protect their own turf. I think part of that comes out because of the idea it's a zero sum game, and
Yes.
that if we aren't growing for population or one thing comes to town, and can you talk about how it doesn't, growing the pie, and if there's an example in any one of these things where, and maybe in Cortex or any of the other two, how you're successfully able to grow the pie so that it isn't somebody wins and somebody loses.
Right. And that's the key. It's a hackneyed phrase, but it has to be a win-win situation.
Hmm.
And oftentimes people focus pretty much solely on what their job is,
Yeah.
what their company is about, what their organization is about. And, about uh, they're not encouraged as much to collaborate.
Hmm.
They're encouraged to get the job done. And that's a factor that really supports this silo building. Um, but what really is important for St. Louis, as I see it, is that particularly in the times that this region is going through with at best, zero population gain, but at
Yeah.
worst in certain areas, a
Right.
drop in population, is that we really need to understand that we have to work together, that a victory for you is a victory for me.
Right.
And that is not seen very often by people in this region.
Hmm.
What is seen is if it goes out to the county, it's a loss of the city. If it
Right.
comes to the city, it's a loss for the county. If it goes across the river to the east side, well, we don't think about the east side, but
Right.
it's part of our MSA area.
Right.
And you know, th- companies look at a whole region as well as where they're going to land. And so we need to be focused on the region in everything that we are thinking about and doing. It's wonderful for me to see that over the last 20 years, there's been an emergence of a number of different technology nodes throughout the region. You know, Cortex was one. You're
Right.
doing one here with the geospatial technology play, reaching north to the NGA.
You got
We
39 North with
39 North in the Ag Tech. We've
yeah.
got out in St. Charles, the OPO, and they're focused primarily, the old post office, and they're focused primarily on the IT sector. And
And
now
Gateway South. And I think
Gateway
you're
South,
and
yeah.
me and can you talk a little bit about what's going on there? Because I think people have read a little bit about Gateway South. They know there's a St. Louis connection, good developments. May not know a whole lot more, but they've formally engaged you. And that's again 100 acres, really big idea. And I think they're going to lean into the construction side of things and making improvements there. So talk a little bit about what's going on there and how you are helping them.
Think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a strategic advisor to the Gateway South Design and Construction Innovation District. 100 acres, as you mentioned, immediately abutting Arch Park on the south, basically the Shoto's Landing area and a little bit larger area going south. And the focus is to try to introduce technologies and advanced manufacturing techniques into the construction industry. For the last 100 years, nothing has changed in the
Right.
construction industry.
Yep.
Everything is serial.
Yeah.
One trade after another after another. It's all done outside in the weather.
It's stick built.
It's stick built.
Yeah.
And it takes a long time, and quality control sometimes isn't as good as it needs to be.
Right.
And the whole idea with Gateway South is that it's trying to introduce information technologies, advanced manufacturing into componentizing both individual components and then assembling them into modular volumetric units. This has been historically referred to, as a modular building, but it's not advanced, even though it's been around for 20 or 30 years. In this country, it has not really taken hold. Internationally, it has. So what Gateway South is trying to do is to make St. Louis, in the center of the country, the hub for componentized, modular, advanced manufacturing to build and assemble and then ship by the river
I
because
see.
it's on the Mississippi, by rail because there are national rail lines that come right through the district, and by interstate highways across the country for assembly. So it's off-site modular assembly and then shipped to on-site
I see.
for erection. And the whole idea is that it's faster and eventually will be cheaper. There are a number of factories that have cropped up, but we're still evolving this. And the whole idea for this kind of came from precedents. Boeing was one of the early folks that began to talk about modular. Now they've run into some problems with components, but the whole idea of having a variety of people build individual components according to one, design, and then assembling them at one location. So trying to do that here in the United States, it's been very slow to be adopted here. And whereas in Europe and in the Far East, they're probably 20 years ahead of us at this point.
And with the AMIC starting up by
Yes.
Rankin, which is not immediately proximate, but an award that was given one of, I don't know, a dozen or 15 to build this new advanced manufacturing facility. And so there'll be coordination with what's going on both at the trade level up at Rankin and I guess mostly with the trades then.
That's correct. And so there are 8 verticals for AMIC. And the 8th one is construction, a construction vertical that they've added to it from the communications that we've had with them.
That's great.
And that construction vertical is going to be housed in Gateway South. So there is in the Crundon Martin building, which when you come over 64, you see it to the left, that large brick structure, very historic. In the Crundon Martin West building, it's going to be a high bay prototyping lab. And so universities that are doing research in new materials, whether they're actual, wall systems or electronic systems related to energy, energy generation, storage, those kinds of things. Prototyping can go on in this high bay laboratory, and then as it's proved out, and it can then be put into the factories that are going to be there that are assembling these things.
Mhm.
And the companies can also, not just the universities, but the companies that are going to be throughout the region can also utilize that prototyping and testing a high bay
I see.
lab. So the whole idea is to advance the construction industry with new technologies that will make it faster and cheaper, and higher quality. Um, the wonderful play on this is that it really connects to the community as far as jobs go.
Sure.
And if you think about the way the construction industry has operated and still does, you know, when there's not a job, workers are on the bench.
Yeah.
The beautiful thing about having advanced manufacturing construction factories that are building these things and assembling these things and shipping them then across the country for assembly elsewhere is that you can have a manufacturing job 24/7, 365. It's not just the start of one job and then it stops.
Yeah.
And until your company gets another job, you're kind of like
Yeah. Yeah.
idle.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and this is a way for us to also train folks in underrepresented communities and economically, challenged communities in our neighborhoods and region, um, and really do job training and skill training. This is where AMIC comes in as well,
Mhm.
and working together with all of the workforce development partners, because St. Louis is trying to become an advanced manufacturing center.
And going back to the manufacturing roots that we had for so many years, and a
Exactly.
lot of the as those jobs went overseas or machines or technology replaced a lot of those jobs, St. Louis did not really pivot into say where an Austin went or a higher technology thing. It was so the AMIC or is a way that we get back to our roots in some ways.
That's correct. That's correct. And it's not that we're going to abandon other, like we're very strong in the ag tech sector and also the bio sector and with information technology. But this is a whole area of manufacturing which was a big part of our history, as you pointed out,
Mhm.
and can be again. And being in the center of the country,
Right.
transportation and supply chain, if we've learned
Yeah.
anything since 2020,
Yeah.
the fragility of that and the need to onshore again.
Right.
Now, what does that mean? In a country that has a higher living standard than many parts of the world that are producing product and shipping it to the United States, it means that we might have to pay some higher prices.
Yeah.
But there are trade-offs for this,
Sure.
trade-offs for it. And so we have to recognize that you can't have your cake and eat it too.
Yeah.
If you want security, if you want to be able to not have supply chain interruptions, you might have to pay a little bit more for that. But you're also employing people.
Right.
So,
Yeah. Always that model. And in thinking about different models, the traditional, you've talked before about the suburban innovation district where there is an anchor institution. There's is it in North Carolina, 200 or 300 acres, and that model of having that academic institutions develop these research parks. And the model
it's
is
pivoted.
the model's changing
That's
now
correct.
as far as what millennials have been looking for and more integration into these urban areas. And so, if you could talk about the role of these
Hmm.
anchor institutions, or maybe just how
Hmm.
these innovation districts are changing.
Yeah. So the term science park was coined after World War II. And in the early 50s, the first, quote, science park was started at Stanford, and it was supported with research dollars from the federal
From the
government,
federal
from
government, right?
DoD. Soon thereafter, within a few years, probably 5 years or so, Triangle Research Park in North Carolina with 3 universities was started. And then this whole science park movement started
Hmm.
with other universities across the country. And so over 100, probably close to 200 science parks cropped up across the country. Usually one anchor institution, though, associated with that park. Now, what does it mean, a science park? Well, it was a business park, an industrial park for the commercialization of research that was
Hmm.
being done at those institutions. So oftentimes it was primarily research institutions that were spinning out that technology,
Hmm.
and they would start with an incubator or accelerator. They would also attract companies that wanted to do research with that institution to move in. Most of those were in the suburbs and some even in rural areas.
Hmm.
A number of them were land grant universities, um, and many of those land grant universities are rural.
I see.
Politically, they were put, in different parts of a state in order to generate economic activity,
Hmm.
as well as educational opportunities. And that was the model that really continued to be developed. And from seeing it in the United States, it then cropped up internationally. What happened in 1990, the mid 90s, with again, the move of millennials back to the urban area, wanting to be in more of an urban area and not just in a suburban.
Yeah, and rely on the car and just be you're in a bubble.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly, in a
yeah,
bubble, and going into a large building, parking your car in a surface
right.
parking lot, going into a large
So
building, working all day and leaving.
or you're in
Yeah,
the cafeteria for lunch. I mean, there's no way
exactly.
by the time you leave, get off the reservation, go get food, get back, it's a 2 hour deal, and that's a problem. Creates tension with other people, and so yeah, the idea of a more integrated product, maybe.
That's
I mean,
exactly right.
in some ways, Cortex is suburban in some ways as a corporate park, but there's many, as I think you've talked about, the neighborhoods are right there,
Yeah.
and so.
Yeah, and so what happened was this migration in the '90s, and particularly strongly in 2000, first decade of 2000s, of the emergence of what have been coined innovation districts, urban innovation districts. And that's really started up big time in the first decade and began to take roots. Cortex was started in 2002, and there were quite a number of others across the country, in Pittsburgh, um, in other locations, in Boston,
Mhm.
in Cambridge Square, in Cambridge, and um, a lot of those urban models, Columbia the same, began to emerge with strong anchor institutions. A different model because many of these are collaborative with multiple partners,
Mhm.
multiple academic
Like
institutions,
Cortex,
like
the
Cortex,
ones you mentioned. Yeah.
exactly like the ones I mentioned. And they are part of the urban fabric, and they differentiate themselves. It's kind of like an urban business district that you found previously over 50 years in a
Mhm.
suburban area. But it integrates, and this is another difference. It integrates mixed uses with these
Mhm.
urban innovation districts, and they have to.
Mhm.
Uh, they have neighborhoods that surround them. They need amenities to support the workers that are there. So they need food, they need retail. Many of them have residential, either existing neighborhoods or they build units within the districts as well. So it becomes a 24/7, 365 environment for people
Mhm.
that want that.
Right. Well, it's, and I think you've talked about this before. It's a more traditional city model where that's the way it used to always be. The live, work, play was just, they didn't talk about it like
No,
that.
they
You
didn't.
you
No.
you went to work, you walked, you took public
Yeah,
transportation, and then
that's
the
right.
schools, and it was all integrated. And so it's interesting. It's come full circle then.
Yeah. So when I lived in Philadelphia, when I was developing the National Shared Housing Resource Center, that was the model for Philadelphia
I see.
for 150
Right.
years. Uh, the industrialization was in the city. It
Right.
wasn't out in the county.
Right.
And so people lived in the neighborhoods that surrounded those industries, and they walked oftentimes, to work, and they ate in the neighborhoods and lived in the neighborhoods that surrounded it. And it's very much, you can see it all throughout Philadelphia. That was the model, and that's for the large industrial cities.
Right.
100 years ago, that's the way it worked.
Right.
It wasn't until
The
the
car,
interstate
right.
highway system
Yeah.
and post World War II, with and those are called defense highways. They were put in place by the federal government
By the-
because of World War II.
Yeah, the
and
Eisenhower administration.
exactly, and
So
the need to diversify.
Yeah.
Not just have targets that people could bomb in cities, but kind of spread across the country. And but that was where the suburban spread began, and where suburbs happened.
Yeah.
And now it has reversed itself in the 2000s.
So Dennis, you added another, the live work play is kind of gotten so overused, but then I think you've talked about live work play and learn, which
Right.
talks about then the intersection of the academic side of how this enters the equation. And so how have you seen the learning component get integrated into that live work play?
Yeah. So every academic institution, higher education institution, is in competition for faculty. Okay. And students, both. All right. So, with the migration more toward a tech economy in this country over the last 20, 30 years, um, students going to universities many of them are looking for tech related jobs upon graduation. Um, and for students going to a university where there is an innovation district that's associated with it means that there can be internships while they're there.
Sure.
They can be introduced to tech companies while they're there. They can, even upon graduation, maybe be hired by one of those tech companies. So it becomes a competition for students, that this play for an urban innovation district sponsored by an academic institution or two or three, it becomes a marketing tool for them to be able to attract students. But it's not just students, it's blue chip faculty as well.
I see.
More and more young faculty, not the older dinosaurs, where it was pure research and that was it. I mean, over my 25-year career, I don't know how many heads of department heads I talked to that said, "Look, if I wanted to be in business, I would have become a business major. I'm an academic. I'm a researcher. Don't bother me with business."
Well, and that gets back to the silo thinking again.
Exactly.
And now it's crossing over and interconnectedness. Yeah.
But younger faculty in the last decade or two are saying, "Oh, wait a minute here. If there is an opportunity for me to commercialize my research,
Yeah. Right.
I want to do that.
Sure.
Because heck, I might want to take a sabbatical and start a company or something like that." Which was a model that Stanford actually evolved. They were the first ones that started doing that. More of an open academic institution where the boundaries between the private industry and academic were blurred, and they gave freedom to faculty and students, but faculty in this case, to be able to pursue their
That's
dreams,
great.
come back 4 or 5 years later, and bring that knowledge and information and understanding back, that real world experience back into the academic environment. So urban innovation districts solve those issues for younger faculty that want to have the opportunity, if they can patent something, to see if they can commercialize it. So that's a change in the model. The old model was to commercialize it. It would just be patented by the university. The university would license it out to an existing company or to a startup company, but originally it was to an existing company because they got higher revenue
I see.
by licensing fees for that.
But the IP was owned by the university at that point.
And it still is owned by the university, but it's a joint ownership in terms of the founding.
It's a different model now.
It's a different model now, and the offices of technology management in urban areas, in particular, have pivoted a great deal to train and support faculty members to think more entrepreneurially. And to be able to commercialize that technology then in an innovation district that might be adjacent or very close to that academic institution. So they can still teach, they can have students, but they can also see their technology being developed maybe by a company where they have a relationship, a technology officer relationship with that company. But so they're wearing many hats. So urban innovation districts solve a lot of those kinds of issues for both students as well as for blue chip faculty, as well as for the administration of these colleges that have to figure out how do we stay afloat.
Sure, yeah, because there's more competition.
More competition.
So if we were to look forward to some of the work you're doing now, and where do you kind of see this heading the next 20 years?
Well, if I could answer that question, I would be a billionaire. I think that it's uncertain as to where it's going. Let me start with what impact the pandemic had on urban innovation districts. It's obvious we stayed at home. There was we jumped ahead many, many years into virtual. I mean, leapfrogged.
Yeah, just
out of necessity.
Out of necessity, right?
Yeah. And it's really interesting because Julie and I have had an ongoing debate about distance and virtual and whether it would remain or go away after the pandemic. Initially, I think she was of the belief that no, as soon as this goes away, everybody's going to come back into the office because you can't do innovation in a vacuum. You have to be face to face. And I was sort of a little bit, the contrarian on that and saying, well, I'm not so sure that that's the case.
Because the advantage is you could start having conversations with people. They didn't have to get on planes. You could, even if you weren't doing the before the meeting and after the meeting and those connections, you at least were having conversations which you really couldn't have had previously.
Yeah, and your reach was much farther.
Yeah.
And you're exactly right. I mean, you could be talking to somebody halfway around the world multiple times a week and never leave your house or your company, wherever you were at. So virtual is here to stay. The question is how it gets parsed by tech sector. So the only folks that did not work from home during the pandemic were bench lab people, whether it was of a bio nature or whether it was some lab that required engineering and assembly and that kind of thing.
You need lab animals, or you have plants, or you have to go. The equipment's there. You can't do that remotely.
Yeah, and any kind of research experiments that you were doing, you had to monitor and babysit them and watch what was going on. So in the biosector in particular, that remains strong and robust. But anybody that was office based and more, intellectually based in terms of, their the product that they had to sell, they were the ones that went home. What happened is a social change that I don't think people really at the time recognized. I didn't recognize it. It emerged, and that social change that emerged was the recognition of a couple of other macro factors. One which is different than the ones you mentioned, which is the aging population. Okay, our moms and dads are, getting older and older, and those people needing support and care, oftentimes from their family members. So family members needing to be more at home and more available. That trend is continuing.
Yeah.
And what's happening is that during the pandemic, we saw what happened to childcare and special needs people, and we saw that flexibility that was introduced. And the workforce, many people in the workforce are reluctant to give that up at this point.
Sure.
And it's been interesting for me to watch some of the larger companies try to force that issue.
Yeah.
No, you're back or you're out.
Yeah.
And a number of those large companies are now retreating because the workforce isn't as robust in terms of sheer numbers as it was before.
Right. Right. It's employees have the advantage right now.
Exactly.
Especially skilled ones. So
The HR department became a big part of the C-suite in the last 4 or 5 years.
yeah. One way I've seen it handled, I mean, I guess the hybrid work is, you have sick days, you have vacation days, and the way I've seen it is you get, let's say, 40 flex days a year,
Yeah.
and you can use those. And the idea isn't that you're at home taking a day off, but that you're at home working and having that. And so I think it is interesting to see how the private sector is dealing with those. And if you're a programmer, you can probably be just as effective in how you monitor that.
Right.
But in terms of like even just a very pragmatic thing of take Venture Cafe, one of the most successful programs, you know, in the whole country of meeting every single week, 500 people showing up, and that ultimately I think became a casualty of COVID. Because it's one thing if you're already in the office and it's 4 o'clock on a Thursday and you think, leave the emails, I'm going to go down and get a beer or whatever, and then other people showed up too. But if people aren't already there, are they going to make the trip in? And so the question would be is how do you, in terms of program versus bricks and mortar? And you've said if you make the program, the buildings will come. And so how do we, in this environment where you don't have to come in, start to develop program and reasons for people to come in a hybrid work environment?
It's interesting. Venture Cafe, there are only 2 of the venture cafes that are trying to reposition, regroup. One is St. Louis, and the other is in Rotterdam.
Hmm.
The other venture cafes in this country and internationally have
And let me stop you for a second. That
Mhm.
was something that was developed by Wexford, right?
No,
Oh,
that was developed by CIC,
oh, okay.
Cambridge Innovation Center in Kendall Square, right across from MIT. They started about the same time that Cortex did.
I see. And the model was that each one could kind of be independent, right?
Yes.
And then I think they brought that back in, or I don't know, maybe, as
Well,
far as
well, so CIC is primarily a co-working and shared office space arrangement. They were kind of there before WeWork started, but focused almost entirely on technology
I
related
see.
co-working and shared office space. They're for profit, and they recognized that there needed to be something programmatically to begin to bring these people together.
Yeah, and
you
just
know?
have a little bit of fun. And
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
And so they started a nonprofit, and that was Venture Cafe.
I see.
And it started in, just as CIC started in Kendall Square. Cortex was the first expansion of both CIC and Venture Cafe
Hmm.
outside of Kendall Square to see if it would work. And lo and behold, it did. And CIC now works closely with Wexford, where Wexford is doing different innovation districts across the country. They do them often in partnership with CIC
see.
on providing that space. And the CIC also has now a shared lab model
I see.
that they also bring along. But it's interesting that what it's kind of like Venture Cafe is following the same pattern that other companies are following, in that it's not one size fits all. Uh, companies have to figure out for themselves how much virtual can we handle, how much in office do we have to have, and it's different for different companies and different industry sectors. Ironically, it seems to be the same case with Venture Cafe and meetups. So, Miami, Philadelphia, Boston, Providence, these different places where it exists out in Arizona, et cetera. they have a different experience. Now, they've all taken hits, but not to the extent that we did here
Hmm.
in St. Louis. And so now there's a regrouping and a new model that's beginning uh, to be tested out here in St. Louis, but it's not the same as it was. Um, and we'll just have to see how that goes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the idea of if you have the right thing or the right program, people will show up, whatever that is, if there's a reason to show up. And I think one of the issues that WeWork has or has had is what is the cachet? How are you? What are you offering more than free Wi-Fi and coffee?
Exactly.
And and in terms of that, but it seems that places like Cortex, that's the thing, and maybe to your point earlier, that each one has to answer what they
Right.
provide.
Yeah, exactly. And as we move ahead, there is no question that supply chain issues are really as a result of COVID, are really impacting how this country is looking at itself, as we mentioned before, in terms of onshoring more, federal government becoming much more involved in trying to support the emergence of advanced manufacturing and taking a little bit more control from a security perspective.
Hmm.
And it's not just in this country, but it's also in other parts of the world. I mean, there's a large global political struggle going on. China, Russia pulling closer together, trying to become much more of a world power, challenging the United States and its allies. And that whole global phenomenon is going to work itself out in a number of different ways that are yet to be seen. Unfortunately, or underlying all of that, which takes this supply chain stuff and this global politics, it takes attention away from climate change issues.
Hmm.
And there's just a real tension right now with all of these energy producers, historically, globally, that don't want to change.
Hmm.
And so uh, being forced, in that direction, but very reluctant to change and to reduce carbon footprints. Yes, we have a number of progressive companies and governments that are trying to push in that direction, but it's an economic issue. And that tension, that tension of companies wanting, that are in the energy sector, wanting to resist it, but at the same time recognizing that it has to come,
Hmm.
and hopefully it comes before it's too late.
Hmm.
But that is a huge um, tech sector that's going to get, I think, much more traction in the next decade, in
Hmm.
particular, because we don't have too many more decades before we've really kind of going to have to throw in the towel on this planet.
Hmm.
So there has to be much more focus on climate change and energy production and new technologies that might be able to clean the atmosphere and clean the oceans and cool the temperatures, because the rapidity of this, suddenly it's picking up. And interestingly, skeptics are now becoming more open to
Hmm.
becoming believers. I've always been a person, who has followed science and technology. I'm a vaccine person.
Yeah.
I recognize that there are downsides and side effects like anything you get shot with or you take orally. There are side effects, unintended side effects.
Risks and
Risks, yeah, exactly. But
right.
but at the same time, there are more believers, and climate change is making it happen. And I'm afraid that just yesterday we learned. I think it was NOAA came out and mentioned that this hurricane season is going to be really bad because of how warm the oceans are
Hmm.
and what's happening underwater.
Hmm.
So there's going to be have to be an acceleration, I believe, because of some of these mega issues, um, toward changing the way we do business. And I think technology is going to become, well, they're going to be right at the center even more than they are now.
So the American Geographical Society, the AGS, has an annual conference, their 2050 conference at Columbia every year, and they picked 2050 as far enough in the future, not too far. And so I went to that last fall, and the sense was, well, we picked 2050, but it's now. Like a lot of the things, and they're in terms of just this is really the geographer's moment because they've collected all this data and what it's starting to indicate. And I guess the question is, maybe to your point, how does it impact policy? And because of politics and geopolitical, and people work on election cycles, which are not generational, they're what's going on in the next 4 years or 6 years, and how do I get reelected? But it would seem to me that it's a combination of policy that would be the path forward. And perhaps then that's where the academia comes in and helps lead that and shows that.
Well, I hope so. But, the indication seems to be right now, particularly in this country, that politics is so divisive.
That is true.
And so, how do you get policy to effectively address these issues that are essential and critical in order for survival? I mean, you can't be bickering too much longer.
Yeah.
It's going to have to take some progressive policy, and that's going to mean reaching across the aisle, and we haven't demonstrated that yet.
Well, and that gets back to that silo level of thinking. And
Exactly.
people protecting their own
Exactly.
turf. And so
Exactly.
if the path forward is technology and it is then a collaboration on the political side, the technology side, it seems then that's a place where those innovation districts can help to foster that.
Yes, I would agree, and I think that reaching back to my theological training and my philosophy, we we need we need to learn. All of us need to learn how to walk better in somebody else's shoes.
Yeah.
It's not just the naysayers, the anti-vaxxers, etc. Um, uh, it's also the people um, who believe these things today and believe we all believe we're right, or we wouldn't hold the beliefs
Sure.
that we have. So we have to uh, figure out how to listen, how to find a middle that has been lost. Um, and these are the precursors to allowing these academic research, things to be able to really be brought into the culture more robustly and into businesses and into new products and into changing the status quo. So it's all connected. I mean,
Mhm.
it is a web, and it's very complex, but there is clearly a role for innovation districts and even the science parks that are out there.
Mhm.
Those regional suburban science parks. Um, there has to be an acceleration of research to solve these global issues that are becoming more acute on a daily basis.
Well, and it doesn't seem that model exists right now. It's something new that we can't necessarily look to the past and say, well, we did this before. It's institutions are changing and the role of the individual and how that all fits together. And so we have to develop those new models.
Yeah, and usually when you think about how those changes come, oftentimes there's a precipitating incident or
Mhm.
issue.
Like COVID or something like
Yeah,
that that
something
accelerates
that's
or whatever.
traumatic,
Yeah.
or the Black Plague.
Yeah, right. Little things like
Little
that,
things
right?
like that, but things that require you to pivot,
Right.
that force you to pivot. They're inflection points. I don't know exactly what the inflection point is going to be. We've talked about these inflection points. We think that the climate change should be an inflection point, but there still is debate on that. There are a couple of different camps on that or more, but we got to get people all aligned for these things, lest the dinosaurs take over again.
Yeah, right.
I
Yeah.
mean, but inflection points, I don't know. I think in the next decade, there will be a number of rapidly emerging inflection points that are going to absolutely change public policy and and corporate directions.
Well, we've been talking for about 50 minutes, so it's always very interesting, Dennis, to talk and hear what you have to say and your perspective on these things. Maybe in closing remarks, I mean, are you feeling optimistic about the ability for us to solve these challenges, or pessimistic, or what do you think?
Um, yes, I am optimistic because not to be optimistic is not emotionally or mentally satisfying.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've done it before, right? I mean, the
We
idea
have done it
of
before,
we're nothing if not a great country of innovation, right?
right?
We've demonstrated this ability faced with obstacles like this to rise to the occasion.
Yes. And I do believe that in this case, we have our back against the wall of our own creating, our own
Hmm.
creation. We backed ourselves up against the wall with what's going on geopolitically and climate wise. And I, on the climate side, I do believe that it's going to take a technological solution. I'm optimistic that will come. I don't know exactly what it will be, but it has to be some stuff that's dramatic. But I do believe that we can reach deep again
Yeah,
and we can find solutions. And I want to be optimistic about that.
yeah, very good. All right, thanks so much.
Okay, my
All right.
pleasure.